Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. On February 15th of 1820, in the town of Adams, Massachusetts, one of the Berkshires' most famous and influential daughters was born, a woman whose face would one day grace American currency. This child was named Susan B. Anthony. Susan was the second oldest of 7 children, born to Daniel Anthony and Lucy Reed. Almost all of the Anthony children would go on to fight for the rights of the treaded-upon classes all over the developing nation in one way or another. But their stories are for future episodes. This one is about Susan. They all seemed to take after their father, who was raised a Quaker. But after marrying outside the religion, and then operating a school of dance in his house, the church disowned him. That didn't stop him from going to Quaker meetings. He was on the side of temperance, and an abolitionist, which he passed on to his children. Their father acquired a management position at a cotton mill in Battenville, New York, so the family had to move away from the Berkshires when Susan was 6. 10 years later, Susan was sent to a boarding school for Quakers. Again, she had to pack up and move to Philadelphia, where she found she felt suffocated. But her education there ended after only a single term, when her family lost their money in a financial downturn in 1837. Similar to the Great Depression, the family was kept afloat by an uncle, but Susan still had to find a job, so she became a teacher at a Quaker school. Next, the family packed up and moved to Rochester, New York. There they joined a Quaker group, free of the restrictions that prevented many others from taking part in social reform activities. Her family began to involve themselves in a number of other groups, focused on the rights and equality of women. But Susan wasn't there for those. She'd taken a job in the town of Canajoharie, New York, as head mistress of the Canajoharie Academy. It was there that she began to dress with a little more color. Though her dresses were still simple, they were brighter. And she changed her speech from the traditional old-fashioned Quaker manner to a more expressive style. She was exposed to more people from more parts of the world and heard all of the newest news. Feeling so connected excited Susan. But it also exposed her to the discrepancies, inequality of the working world, like the differences in pay between men and women who were doing the same job and had the same experience. Yes, this is how long that bit of unfairness has been going on, and of course, for much longer. Back in the smaller worlds of her previous hometowns, she hadn't been faced with that sort of news. But she for a moment questioned if it was all that important that women be given the right to vote. She later said of this time in her life, "I wasn't ready to vote. I didn't want to vote. But I did want equal pay for equal work." Her father had gone into yet another line of work by beginning an insurance business. So, when the academy unfortunately closed, Susan went home to run the farm. But Susan had tasted freedom, and she could only live closed off from the world for so long. So she found distraction by devoting all of her time to causes that might benefit all people. So much so that others began to take notice, and she could charge for a speech. From then on, she would make all of her money on speaking fees. Susan met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851. Elizabeth had been working for women's suffrage, and the two women became fast friends. Though Susan had no children and was free to travel and work as she pleased, Elizabeth had 7 children and found it hard to find the time she longed for. Time to write about women's suffrage. Susan began to help support Elizabeth's family so that Elizabeth could have the time to work on her writing. They made a fantastic team. Susan may have been a great speaker, but she never thought much of her skill as an author. Temperance became a favorite issue of the pair. It was very much a women's right issue of the time, when if a woman's husband was a drunk, there was very little she could do about it. Even if his drinking caused him to abuse the children and run the family into poverty, if the wife were to try to divorce him, which was hard enough, the man of the family commonly got custody of the children. Susan fought for the sale of alcohol to be outlawed in the state of New York, and attended the World's Temperance Convention in New York City in 1853. She said of the event, which balked at the idea of a woman speaker, "No advanced step taken by women has been so bitterly contested as that of speaking in public. For nothing which they have attempted, not even to secure the suffrage, have they been so abused, condemned, and antagonized." Susan threw her energies into working for mainly women's rights issues after that, but did call for the admission of African American students into public schools and universities, as well as that teachers should receive equal pay regardless of gender. The women's rights movement had been growing for a while before Susan started to voice her ideas on the topic. The very first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. Susan would first attend this convention 2 years later when it was held in Syracuse, New York. One problem the movement always seemed to have was a lack of funding. This was a time when women didn't often have a source of income of their own, and if they did, the law usually required that they give their earnings to their spouse. In 1860, due in part to Susan's work, the law would be changed to give married women the right to their own and separate property. But just 2 years later, a good deal of that law would be retracted during the Civil War, when many women who had fought for it were distracted by efforts to help support their families and the men at the front. At this time, when Susan had seen fit to work for anti-slavery causes, she was asked by Lucy Stone, an organizer for the women's movement, to take over arranging conventions. Susan wasn't sure she wanted to. She told a friend that, "The experience of the last winter is worth more to me than all my temperance and women's work, though the latter were the school necessary to bring me into the anti-slavery work." But after Lucy Stone had a baby and said she'd have to give it all up, Susan did in fact take over. She also became the secretary of the organization, and Elizabeth its president. Being secretary left Susan with the time to fight for the cause of abolition. Elizabeth and Susan were close, very close. Elizabeth spent more time with Susan than anyone else, and Elizabeth kept a room ready for Susan everywhere she lived. Her anti-slavery work included the Underground Railroad, and she even noted that she once fitted out a fugitive with the help of Harriet Tubman. In a time when even Abraham Lincoln was expressing the view that after their freedom was granted, African Americans should be sent to colonies in Africa, Susan voiced the opinion that they should instead be offered places in American schools and in places of business, so that they can make their own honest living and way of life in this nation. Susan was able to collect what equated to the signatures of 1 out of every 24 citizens in the United States on a petition in opposition of slavery. In 1856, an amendment to the Constitution was proposed that would give citizenship to slaves, but also put the word male into the Constitution. Susan rushed back home from a long stay with her brother while she'd helped him with it. Susan rushed back home from a long stay with her brother, where she'd been helping him with his newspaper. She said of the matter, "If the word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out." Susan indeed wanted all people to be equal, but was afraid of hurting the women's movement through this poorly worded amendment. After the Civil War, Susan fought to regain the ground they'd lost while helping with the war effort. While most others working for equality were focused solely on the rights of slaves to freedom, saw no reason why the two had to be separated. Freedom for all was what they aimed for. Equality for all. At one point, a man named Wendell Phillips was so outraged by this that he blocked funding to their organization. He began a group called the Anti-Female Suffrage Committee, while also supporting suffrage for black men. The Revolution was the title of a weekly that Susan and Elizabeth began publishing together. It covered mostly women's suffrage and issues related to that topic. Its motto was, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." It was supposed to become a daily, but the money that was pledged for that by a Mr. Train could no longer be acquired after he was arrested in England for backing Irish independence. As they worked on the publication of the Revolution, the 15th Amendment, the one that gave black males the right to vote, was in fact ratified in 1872. Their opposition to it, while other women's groups supported it, created a deep rift in the suffrage movement as a whole. It wasn't until 1890 that the groups began to merge again. It was then that the National American Women's Suffrage Association was created. Elizabeth became president, but after her retirement, Susan took her place. Susan became one of the most well-known and well-regarded political leaders of this time, though she never took a salary from the organization. She'd had some wealthy friends who would pay some of her expenses and even lend her a personal train car to get around in. And though Susan did charge for lectures, most of that money went right back toward the cause. She'd always dressed and lived simply. She also never married. It wasn't that she didn't want to. It was that married women forfeited their personhood to their husbands, one outcome of which was that they could no longer sign contracts, which Susan needed to in order to run her many organizations and programs. The press loved her, whether they made her out to be a pioneer or a maniac. Stories about Susan sold papers, and there was plenty to write. She gave about 85 speeches a year and traveled thousands of miles. She also took part in gatherings that weren't for her. She and her nieces, that's what she called the loyal group of women who followed and helped her, would walk straight into completely unrelated conferences, like they belonged there, step out on stage, give a few speeches, and hand out flyers, then leave the crowd wowed. In 1869, Wyoming allowed women to vote, and in 1870, Utah followed. Susan felt hopeful like never before. They were really getting somewhere. She also encouraged women to try to vote, even before it was legal. Where they live, some women got away with it. Rarely. Most of the time, the women were dragged away from the ballot box and chastised. In 1872, in Rochester, New York, the presidential elections were underway. Susan gathered up about 50 women, and they all went to vote. A few of them were actually able to talk their way into casting ballots, but most were stopped before they could. Susan's attempt did not go over very well. She was arrested and charged with attempting to vote illegally. Those other women who had managed to cast a ballot, they were arrested too, but then released. Susan's trial would be held in Monroe County, New York, and thankfully she wasn't locked up to wait for it. So she went on a tour and spoke in every single town in that county. "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" she asked. "We no longer petition legislature or Congress to give us the right to vote, but appeal to women everywhere to exercise their too long neglected citizens' right." This speech that she gave in those towns was printed in a newspaper, which made it even more widely available. Worried that Susan's activities would ruin the case for them, the district attorney moved it to a federal circuit court located in Ontario County. So Susan gave a speech in every single one of those towns too. At the time, it was not normal for a defendant to say anything during the trial until after the verdict was read. So after 3 days, when she was asked if she had anything to say, she gave what is her most important speech, and probably the most well-known speech of all women's suffrage, part of which went, "This high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored." And as she went on, and the judge told her to settle down, to be quiet, she did not listen. She stood up and spoke on, and told them precisely what she thought of them. She spoke about her outrage at her denial of a trial by jury, but then commented that it wouldn't really be a jury of her peers anyway, as women were not allowed to be jurors, which is true. How would she find any sympathy from a jury full of men, and not a single woman among them to sympathize with her? Susan was fined $100. She responded, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." She stuck to her guns. They never saw a cent. Susan's brazen show in that courtroom won her even more fans. Women everywhere men too, suddenly took pride in this woman who couldn't be held down. Susan and Elizabeth started working on a book. It wasn't supposed to be a big project. They'd only planned one book, but instead, it ended up as volumes, 6 altogether. It was the entire history of the women's suffrage movement, and it would take them 41 years to write. In fact, the last 2 volumes weren't completed until after Susan passed away, and the last book ended with a nationwide victory, women winning the right to vote, in 1920. Susan felt that there was even more to do, and traveled to Europe to work for international women's suffrage. President Cleveland held a reception at the White House and invited her. Susan was also part of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. While there, she was wowed by Buffalo Bill Cody, who rode toward her upon a beautiful horse. With a flourish, welcomed her to the event and invited her to a show. Onlookers applauded as Susan drew out a white handkerchief and fluttered it at him. Susan and Elizabeth were aging. That, of course, was obvious. But as, with age, Susan began to relax a little, Elizabeth became more brazen. Elizabeth's The Woman's Bible was published in 1895 and sold in great numbers. This book outlined how the Bible had been used over the years to keep women down, to keep them in their place. It won Elizabeth both praise and criticism, surprisingly also, from Susan. Deep down, Susan was still a Quaker. Deep down, she still very much respected the Bible. Elizabeth's criticism of it somehow crossed a line in Susan's mind, though she knew, she had witnessed it, she had suffered it, that what Elizabeth said was in fact true. It still didn't sit right. Susan said to Elizabeth, "You say women must be emancipated from their superstitions before enfranchisement will have any benefit. And I say just the reverse, that women must be enfranchised before they can be emancipated from their superstitions." Despite their differences, the two still remained the best of friends. Until 7 years later, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton died. Susan said of this, "Oh, this awful hush! It seems impossible that voice is stilled, which I have loved to hear for 50 years. Always, I have felt I must have Mrs. Stanton's opinion of things before I knew where I stood myself. I am all at sea." Susan, now alone, moved to live with her sister. She'd spent most of her time in hotels and staying with Elizabeth before that. But she didn't slow down. In Yosemite National Park, she took a tour upon a mule at the age of 75. And, of course, she never stopped working, though she did have to do an awful lot more of the writing by herself. She went to the California suffrage campaign and talked to audiences, excited to see her, 3 times a day. Her 80th birthday was spent at the White House as a guest of William McKinley. But at age 86, in her home, at that time in Rochester, New York, she came down with pneumonia and then died when she suffered from heart failure. Just days before, while celebrating her birthday in Washington, she'd said, "There have been others also just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name every one. But with such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible." That phrase, "failure is impossible," became the motto for women's suffrage. As her death was on the 13th of March, 1906, Susan did not live to see her dream of women getting the vote come true. A few states had allowed women to vote by then, but not all. It did, of course, happen on August 18th of 1920, when the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, and the Berkshires picked up right where it had started. For in the home county of Susan B. Anthony rests a sleepy little town, who for some time was the very first town to vote in national elections. This is the town, of course, of New Ashford, And it was a woman named Phoebe Jordan, who on November 2nd of that year was the first woman to vote in a national election. The ballot box that she cast her ballot into is still used in New Ashford today. Susan has been honored in many ways, one of those being that her image was used to grace the $1 coin. The Quaker meeting house that she attended as a child still stands at the top of the cemetery in Adams, Massachusetts, and her childhood home, also in that town, is a museum dedicated, of course, to her, and retains many artifacts from her long and amazing life. The work she did changed the nation and the world. But it's not over. Obviously, today, there are still problems, like equal pay for equal work, and women's rights to their own bodies. It's up to us, every woman today, to never neglect our right, to protect it and exercise it, because it hasn't always been there, and it might not always be. This is for our futures. And it's for Susan. It's for all of us. So get out and vote. But don't just vote in the interests of America. Vote in the interests of women. It's been a long time coming, and it's about time there really were equality for all. This has been The Berkshires Gone By, created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Renier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can see an image of Berkshire history every day by following us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. You can find more episodes and more information by following us on Facebook or visiting our website at www.theberkshiresgoneby.com. You can also find episodes by searching for us on YouTube. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope you'll join us next time. Thanks for listening.